Good morning.
Hello, I'd like to speak to Mr. David Sostek. I'm calling from the glaucoma monitoring clinic.
Yeah, the glaucoma clinic. Hi. Yes, I've seen the cancellation.
How are you, his wife?
No, you text me to say the appointment on the 6th of July is cancelled.
Yes, I just wanted to find out if you've got any new problems with your vision.
No, not since last year. No, not at all.
Fine, okay. So we're going to defer it by another 4 months, okay?
Perfect. I realise what pressure you're all under. Don't worry.
Thank you. Thank you. We'll send you another letter.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye. Bye. Hi, Patricia.
Hello, David.
Yeah.
How are you?
Yeah, fine, thank you. Can I ring you back? I'm just about to start a lecture for India on YouTube.
Oh, all right. Yes,
Okay.
that's fine.
So I'll ring you. I'll
Hope
ring
it
you
goes
back.
well.
Okay, thanks. Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Well, good morning, everyone. From a very dull London, it's raining. The sun is not shining, but we're shining, as I'm sure you are in India. And the future is looking bright, much brighter than it did a few weeks ago. We seem to be moving out of lockdown, which is good. The hotels are opening up soon here in London. Restaurants and bars will be open soon, as they are in Europe. So things are looking much better. And as I said to you before, the future's bright, the future's IAHM, and you are very much the future. You are the future of the hospitality industry. And what we're going to talk about this morning is we're going to talk about gastronomy. Now, gastronomy is a huge subject, and it goes on and on. It encompasses sociology, psychology, a little bit of philosophy, food science, production, everything you can imagine around food is the subject of gastronomy. But this morning I'm going to tell you about a very short history of gastronomy. And the history of gastronomy reflects all the traditions of the past and their foundations, and will do in the future. For the great majority of people in the world, their day-to-day concern is to have enough food and drink to survive. And we see that in many parts of the world. How to maintain food security and produce enough food for people. But in other parts of the world, there are others who enjoy food and drink as a pleasure, entertainment, and a great social experience. And we in hospitality, that's what we are all about. We are about, as I've said before, creating that social experience, the pleasure and the entertainment around food. And chefs and culinary people have taught the world about food. You, in the future, will teach the world about food. India has a great deal to offer the world around food, around tradition of food, around the interaction with food, and the history of your spices, etc. Now, we don't know for certain, but the first cook on record was Jacob, the first gastronome with his brother Esau. And among we're talking biblical times and times, among the ancient Greeks, there are many famous people, poets, orators, and philosophers. Greece was a very advanced civilization. The great philosophers were Greek. Socrates, Aristotle, Plato. But Greece never had any prime beef, rich in butter or fresh cream. But because of its climate, the soil was unsuitable for grazing. The Greeks recorded very little about food and wine. But we know a lot about the Greeks in terms of Greek philosophy, but not so much about the food. The main meal of the day for ancient Greeks was the evening meal and could last for several hours. But it was an occasion of eating, drinking, reunion, and recreation. And for many people today, eating is a sense of reunion, recreation, and pleasure. So this goes back thousands of years of the history of food being not just sustain us nutritionally, but to give us entertainment, pleasure. In ancient Rome, which we know a lot about ancient Rome, meals were first simple, but once they conquered the known world, they adopted culinary methods of their victims, of the people they conquered, and introduced into Italy many delicacies. It is on record that when the Roman Senate was divided whether or not to embark upon the Third Punic War and the conquest of Carthage, the elder Couto silenced the peace, partly by producing some fine specimens of African figs, which were evidently considered well worth fighting for. So people fought over food. In our history books, we can see that people fought over food. People bargained with food. Food is a bargaining power. So we can see the power of food and the importance of food. Just 1 second, I must just check. 1 second. Can you see that? Sorry for the interruption. So we can see the bargaining power of food. Besides figs, Africa gave the coarse ribbon melon the Romans who cultivated as cantaloupe melon. So cantaloupe melon came originally from Africa. And cantaloupe melon is the name which is still known today. So cantaloupe melon comes from the Roman time, who literally took it from Africa. A person called Sergens Otter was the first to introduce the bedding of oysters dredged in the open sea and the flattening in the beds of Lucerne Lake. So that's the origin of oysters. Flavins Lupinus introduced a method of fattening edible snails. Sergio Mellitus was the originator of intensive feeding of geese and the inventor of foie gras. So we know that the intention of the intensive feeding of geese boosts the liver, swells the liver, and that is what we call foie gras. And these gastronomes were responsible for advancing the art of cookery in Imperial Rome. So Imperial Rome were the founders of many of the techniques that we know today. The fattening of edible snails, the force feeding of geese to produce foie gras. And that's where all this originates. The Romans preferred boiling and stewing their meats. So boiling and stewing is a very ancient art of cookery coming from the Romans. And these methods to them meant something else. It meant symbolized refinement, culture, and wealth. Over roasting, because they preferred this over roasting because the smoke and fat were reserved for the gods. So they saw smoke and fat not for them, but for the gods. So that's why they preferred boiling and stewing. Roasted meat was mature and transformed like raw food, which was considered barbaric and impoverished by the Romans. The Romans had a taste for rich and well-cooked food, sweet and sour sauces made of honey. Honey is the most natural sweetener. Fruits, vinegar, garum seasoned with herbs, cumin, raw coriander, mint, oregano, and spicings and thickened flour. And much of this is recorded in Roman times. Apicius was a famous Roman chef who wrote all this down. They often had meatballs accompanied with glazed sauces, which was practical because they dined laying down. Now, this is very interesting. In Roman times and in biblical times, when people ate food, they laid down, rather couched, like this, and ate. Now, it's interesting because if this is the case, and we know it's the case, all the photos, or not photos, sorry, all the paintings and recordings of the Last Supper, where the the apostles and the disciples are sitting at the table with Christ, they're upright. But it was more likely that they were laying down, because that was the most common at the time. Common spices included pepper, ginger, asafoetida, spikenard, saffron, and cardamom. They only used olive oil in cooking. So olive oil is one of the oldest oils, or if not the oldest oil for cooking. And it is the most healthiest of oils, olive oil. And at this time, what we do know, that recipes listed just oil, neither pure oil or virgin oil. The Romans designated places of origin for olive oil, as the French now do for wine. So we know that olive oil was given a special place in Roman times, and it was listed where it came from, as the French do for wine today. Burgundy wine, champagne, all the different Bordeaux, all the different wines that we know of France. It's the same with olive oil. But today, what we are seeing is that tradition coming back. Sicilian olive oil, Greek olive oil, Cypriot olive oil. But people want to know where the olive oil is coming from. The best quality and most expensive olive oils were called Oleum Veredite, which is the first pressed green oil. So olive oil was quite precious. Now, Apicius, as I said, Apicius was the first Roman chef. And Apicius wrote everything down. And the best olive oil came from Liburnia, or today it's known as Croatia. And Apicius even gives a recipe for transforming simple olive oil from Spain to that from Liburnia. How to transform it, how to make it richer. So Apicius is the first Roman chef who wrote everything down. So what we know about Roman times is that lots of origin of what we do today comes from Roman times. The Romans were a very advanced civilization. Now, in the Middle Ages and Renaissance, of the 14th and 17th century, 1307 to 1700, over the next millennium, the art of cooking evolved tremendously because it is the art of cooking. And medieval cuisine started to diverge from Roman principles. So we've got Roman principles, which are a foundation of much of what we do today, and then moved into medieval cuisine. They diverged into medieval cuisine. Vegetables were eaten less and less. Bacon and lard replaced olive oil. But the Christian church decreed that fasting was required for 150 days a year. But spices became more varied. And we know today that spices are becoming more and more varied even today. In the 15th century, a taste for sweet and sour established itself in Europe and began to flourish in the later centuries. So we know there is a real liking for sweet and sour sauces, ingredients, methods. And in medieval times, meat became the central part of the meal in Europe. But today, more and more people are eating less meat. But meat was replaced with fish on days of fasting because meat was forbidden to be eaten by the church on a Friday. Meat was considered a luxury you should be without on a Friday. And that's where people say fish for Friday. And today, many people at work, in restaurants, keep to the idea that fish is for Friday. Friday is fish day. The church no longer insists. And indeed, meat is no longer that luxury to go without. And meat and fish were roasted and boiled, served with a light, acidulated sauce. And this is where the acidulation of sauces started in medieval times. It was also common to cook them in a tart or sweet and sour sauce with verjuice or vinegar, sugar or fruits, and seasoned with spices. So we saw in medieval times the cooks started to mix their ingredients, to experiment with their ingredients. The meals generally followed dietary requirements of the times as well as social class structures. Poultry and fruits were for the elite. So the class system enjoyed the poultry and fruits. Root vegetables, dark bread was for the poor. So poultry and fruits for the elite, root vegetables, dark bread, potatoes particularly potatoes, were for the poor. Spices were seen as a sign of luxury and good nutrition and are preferred to herbs. Common spices, and they are exactly the same today: cinnamon, ginger, galangal, cloves, nutmeg, mace, pepper, long pepper, cubeb, grains of paradise, cardamom, and saffron. And these are luxury spices and common, and they are common today. And we know from records that the cooks of these times were known as Talviant, Mustro, Martino, and Matra Chicourt. And I'm sure many of you have never heard of these cooks or chefs, but you would have heard of Escoffier, of Carême. But these chefs and cooks were important at this time because they started to experiment with food, and particularly with spices and sauces. And what many people don't realize, that over 100 books on medieval cuisine were written in Europe between the 14th and 16th century. And these books are in museums. You can look up these chefs. They're on record as having written these medieval cookbooks. And then we go on to the 17th and 18th century, 1700 to 1800. Gastronomy evolved slowly. Medieval and Renaissance tastes remained popular in Europe. French cuisine distinguishes itself by rejecting these tastes. French cuisine started to stand out, but this rejection was more in words than actions. The cooks of the Grand Siècle, the Grand Century, promoted natural flavors, undercooking to respect the product. So the undercooking of meats comes from the French. And you know that steak today, you call it, you order a steak, whether it's bleu, whether it's sagnon, or whether it's bien cuit. So you have bleu, which is well undercooked. Sagnon, undercooked. Just cooked, à point, just cooked. And bien cuit. They're the basic terms of cooking a steak, which comes from the French. Now, the problem is that when people order a steak today, and I've seen it, they really don't know what they're ordering. They say medium, medium rare, medium to well done. What do these terms mean? What do they mean? The only real terms are what the French created during the 17th and 18th century, which was the undercooking of meat. Bleu, sagnon, à point, just cooked, well done. Sagnon, undercooked. Bleu. So we have created a myth with medium to well done. because really there's no such thing. They also, during this period, the French developed stocks, meat juices, and coulis. So the French established themselves as a leader in the development of cuisine, which is still with us today. The fundamentals are with us today. The French discovered the delights of offal, vegetables, artichoke, asparagus, mushroom, peas, cauliflower. The French created the roux, the thickening, emulsified sauces, beurre blanc, hollandaise, arrived along with coffee and cacao. So the French led the revolution in cuisine development, which is still with us today. In 1651, Francois Pierre de la Varenne wrote the Cuisinière François, and he invented puff pastry. There's a good quiz question for you, isn't there? Who invented puff pastry? In 1656, Pierre de Lune wrote Le Nouveau Cuisinière, and he was accredited with invented the bouquet garni. I hope you all know what a bouquet garni is. You know the flavor where you take the leek, you wrap the leek around celery, bay leaf, thyme. He created the bouquet garni. And in recipes today, you still see bouquet garni. You could buy sachets of bouquet garni. And he invented the roux. How to make a roux to thicken it all, butter and flour. Another quiz question. Who created the roux or the bouquet garni? Pierre de Lune. In 18th century, more cookbooks were published than promoted a new classical cuisine. Classical French cuisine was born in the 18th century. Yeah. Just 1 second. Hi, I'm doing a lecture.
Oh, sorry, I'm just on my way home now.
Okay. Yeah. So in 18th century, they created the classical French cuisine. Vincent de la Chapelle, chef de cuisine to Lord Chesterfield, published in English the Cuisine Moderne in 1733. Manon popularized La Nouvelle Cuisine by publishing 3 times the Nouvelle Trente de Cuisine in 1739, La Cuisinière Bourgeoise, 1746, and Les Soupers de la Cour in 1755. And during this period, the dining room became a permanent feature. The dining room became very important part of eating, a part of socialization. So this great birth of French cuisine started to change life dramatically. And then we have cuisine classique, 19th and 20th century, 1801 to 2000. And this is a mix of aristocratic and French bourgeois cuisine, the type of culinary standard in Europe during the 19th century up to the beginning of the 20th century. Cuisine classique is a traditional cuisine which we are familiar. It is a mix of advanced recipes and local dishes. And it's heavily influenced by broths during the 17th century. You see how we evolve food from century to century. Cuisine classique produced new basics that are still in use today. The mirepoix, carrots, onion, celery. Espagnole, mirepoix and broth. Espagnole is not really used much today, but it is a basic brown sauce. demi-glace. Glaces, demi-glace, reduced to consistency of honey, fish stock, veal essences. So we see this was very much influenced during this period. We see a real growth in the 19th and 20th centuries. A bechamel sauce was invented in 1735, and we still use bechamel sauce today. 1735. During the 18th, 19th century, luxury hotels were developed and grand restaurants which all employed French chefs. During this period, the first food writers emerged, and this included the most famous Brillat-Savarin, Guillemot de la Reynière, the inventor of the motor car, started the concept of food tourism and popularized regional food. Another question, quiz question. Who invented the concept of food tourism? It was Guillemot de la Reynière. And what is food tourism? Food tourism is when people go to an area to sample the food. And certain regions and certain countries promote their food tourism. And in India, you have the greatest food tourism. You have the greatest food to export. You have the greatest spices, blend of spices and herbs and different cooking styles to attract people to come to India from all over the world to sample the food. And this is food tourism. During the latter part of the 20th century, restaurants thrived. Regional cookbooks flourished. Over 500 cookbooks were published during the last 20 years of the 20th century. The 19th century is known as the golden age of French gastronomy. The first celebrity chefs spread the influence of French cuisine internationally. Antoine Carême codified French cuisine in his 4-volume work, which culminated in his masterpiece, The Art de la Cuisine Française, in the 19th century. Carême spent 2 years in London cooking for Prince Regent of England and worked also in St. Petersburg, Vienna, and Aix-la-Chapelle. And these chefs, celebrity chefs, worked for aristocracy because they had the money and the power to pay for them. And then came, also a century later, Auguste Escoffier, who I'm sure you'll know. But he modernized Carême's work in his Grand Culinary in 1903 and recognized the workforce in kitchens of the luxury hotels all over Europe. And what Escoffier is famous for is organizing the kitchen into the party system, the sectional system. He created the division of labor used in kitchens known as the party system. Escoffier worked at the Savoy, the Carlton in London, and the Ritz in Monte Carlo and Luzerne. Escoffier is still one of the most famous chefs in the world today. And people remember him for the party system. But other chefs were also famous during their time. Urbain Dubois, royal cook to the Prince Regent of Prussia, popularized the service à la Russe. He started the service à la Russe, the Russian service. The Cuisine Classique in 1856, the École de Culinary in 1876, French cuisine becomes a standard for the great cuisine in Europe. So French cuisine dominated Europe and also has dominated parts of Asia. Service techniques changed, cooking methods and methods for preservation. Cork stoppers in 1700, corkscrew in 1750, the freezer in 1845, the refrigerator in 1933, and pasteurization in 1860. And then we have Nouvelle cuisine. The term Nouvelle cuisine was introduced in 1973 in a Gort Milot article titled Nouveau Guide Gort et Milot. Vive la nouvelle cuisine française, the new cuisine. And what is nouvelle cuisine? The 10 Commandments, as we know them, were declared, the most important of which were rejection of long cooking times. Heavy sauces were out, spicing the marinades that mask the natural flavors of the foodstuff. New techniques were embraced. Food pairing conventions are challenged. Red wine with red meat, white wine with fish, lamb, beans, and new products. Cooking techniques and presentations were welcome. And what Nouvelle Cuisine did is actually revolutionize the way we think about food, the way we think about spices and herbs, but also eclectic cuisine, mixing different types of cuisine, Asian and European. Gort Milot contributed to the popularization of celebrity chefs who are often the disciples of Fernand Point à la Pyramide de Vienne in France, Paul Bocuse, Michel Girard, Paul Hamelin, and the Trois Gras brothers. In the Gort Milot Guide, you may want to look it up, it's still available, the Gort Milot Guide. In 1976, over 100 chefs were listed in the guide under the School of Nouvelle Cuisine. And these chefs made their name under the Nouvelle Cuisine title. In this country, it was very much Anton Mosiman. Nouvelle Cuisine from 1970 to 1980 did not break completely from so-called classic cuisine classique. While Bocuse and his contemporaries promoted la cuisine de marché, respect for the product, lightly cooked sauces, their recipes were still similar to those of cuisine classique. And then came the discovery of Japanese cuisine. And this is what I'm saying. The Nouvelle Cuisine opened up the world where the Asian and European came together. The discovery of Japanese cuisine by these chefs helps them transform the old cuisine, characterized by the fond de sauce, the gravies, into something new. They reduce cooking times, pay more attention to the dietary needs of diners, emphasize artistic presentations, and describe dishes in their menus with extensive details of provenance of ingredients. So much of the chefs of Nouvelle Cuisine were inspired by the Japanese cuisine. Followers of modern cuisine, champions of local food, promoters of Nouvelle Cuisine, find common ground in their beliefs and join forces to oppose the growth of fast food and junk food. Symbols of changing modern diet and the development of the food industry. So these were counteracting the belief in natural ingredients, lighter food, more delicate food, because they wanted to counteract the fast food and junk food movement. And that's a problem, because the junk food, the McDonald's, the Burger Kings, etc., is seen to do quite a lot of harm to people's diet and people's health. A breakthrough in gastronomy is led by European chefs born in the 1950s and 60s. Marc Verret, developers of emulsions, replace gravies with infusions and introduces wild herbs from the Alps in the world of gastronomy. Michel Braus and Regio Macon combine the local food with innovative culinary techniques. Oliver Rellinger introduced flavors from the Orient. Pierre Gagne, Catalan chef Ferran Adrià, and we all know him, famous chef, with the help of findings by scientists such as Hervé, worked to understand the molecular structures that create the unconscious rich and crispy on the natural palate. Their work is named Molecular Gastronomy, and this was the birth of molecular gastronomy. A revolution in cuisine spreads in the 21st century. More humane working conditions in professional kitchens, the rise of women to the rank of great chefs, Hélène Duroz, Anne-Sophia Pic, René Sumut. The authority of restaurant guides is challenged. Alan Suderlin hands back his 3 million stars at his restaurant Lucas Carlton to simplify the menu and reduce the bill, to improve profitability. And this is what we were talking about in kitchen management. You've got to be, it's no good having a successful restaurant unless it's profitable. And what is a successful restaurant? A successful restaurant is you're serving the customers, you're satisfied, but you're making a profit. And many chefs find that it's very hard in the 21st century to make Michelin star restaurants pay, to be profitable. So they move away to start inns, bistros, second restaurants without stars. And then we have spices in European cuisine. So let's have a look at spices in European cuisine. Spices have been used in European cooking from antiquity until after the Renaissance. With the advent of cuisine classique, the use of spices began to disappear. However, spices were rediscovered in the 20th century, thanks to the influence of Asian, North African, and Mexican cuisine. So in the 20th century and the 21st century, we have this renaissance, this beginning to open up the world of spices again. Spices such as pepper, asafoetida, spikenard, saffron, cardamom, sweet and sour sauces that the Romans and the Gallo-Romans used are coming back today. Vinegar, herbs, spices, cumin, coriander. So all the spices that the Romans used, we're coming back today. Cloves followed the taste of Romans. Calamine marks the beginning of the culinary Middle Ages. Cloves were introduced during the Middle Ages. Sauces thickened with bread, such as bread sauce. These all started and are still used today. So we've got a revolution, if you like. The world is taking on board many of the traditions of using spices that the Romans did. Honey, use of honey, as I said, vinegar, use of coriander, mint, and all these spices that the Romans use. And again, in the 13th and 16th century, lots of spices there were used, which we are using today. Cinnamon was common, ginger, cloves, nutmeg, mace, spice. Grains of paradise, mustard were used. All these were used in Roman times, which are being used today. In the reign of Louis the 14th, 17th century, in the Middle Ages, spices were used, including pepper, nutmeg, cloves, aromatic spices. As I said, the bucigani was introduced, more butter, the arrival of butter, and creme fraiche. But during the 19th up to the 20th century, all these spices began to disappear in cooking, but they've actually re-emerged today. We have a great revolution of using spices, and this is where India plays a major part in the world. The Nouvelle Cuisine started this revolution. The Asian spices and the European, and we call it eclectic cuisine. So where are we today? With the revolution of the use of spices and herbs, India plays a major part now in world cuisine. We can see through the history of gastronomy the predominance of the French chefs. But today, it's not. The French chefs do not dominate. It is the celebrity chefs of India, with their imaginative use of spices, who have a great part to play in and contribution in international gastronomy. India is opening up the world in its use of spices, techniques, and particularly in the move away from meat to vegetarian and to vegan. So we see a revolution. And who is leading that revolution but India? India with its use of spices. In Roman times, spices were used, and then we lost up to the 20th century the use of all these spices and techniques. Nouvelle Cuisine brought them back when they introduced Asian into European. But where we are today is that the French chefs no longer dominate the world of international cuisine. It is the Indian chefs who, if they're not doing it, they are able to dominate the world. Their names and their legacy will be like the French chef's legacy of how they have changed the world of gastronomy. And I'm always so enthused and excited when I come to India and I see the different styles of cooking, the different use of spices and herbs. And that in itself is so much to offer the world. So India plays a very important part in the future development of the history of gastronomy. And that's where I will take any questions, if there are any. So be proud of your inheritance. Talk about your inheritance. Talk about how India leads the world in the use of spices, like the Romans did. The Romans led the world. India now is able to lead the world and teach the world. That's the important thing. Teach the world so much in the use of spices and techniques. And I say when I come to Asia, do not assume the West knows best, or the West is the best way. There is so much in Asia that is able to offer the world, especially in international gastronomy. And in years to come, where I've read out all the names of French chefs who've dominated, in 50 years' time or 100 years' time, when I'm not here, we want to be able to have the names of Indian chefs there, how they have influenced the world in the use of spices and techniques. Be proud of what you do. Go ahead and be proud and teach the world about the use of Indian spices and the techniques. India has so much to offer the world. I hope that that is a short history of gastronomy. Complicated in parts, I know, but remember, techniques and spices are important, and India can lead the way in that. Thank you. Any questions? Thank you.